This episode of Between Turns is brought to you by us. Between Turns, we just wanted to do something nice for everybody. No other motivation needed. We just, want to do something nice because we're nice people. Not Cylons. Nope, just nice. Remember, not Cylons. Oh, we need to talk about something else.
Well, I was actually ready to move on, and then you brought up sausage. And I was like,
sorry.
well, all right.
You got me talking about food again. You know it's my weakness. Let's move on.
Moving on. So, what'd you do with your little summer break? Because I did something really super. Well, I didn't say I did something really cool. I played a board game because that's what board games.
Just one? Seriously?
Well, no, I played a bunch that I enjoy. I had fun playing a few while we were on hiatus there, but
you don't sound convinced.
No, I did. It was good, but I found one that just kind of came out of left field, and I had no idea. I mean, I knew it existed, but I kind of just glanced at it and was like, whatever, when I get around to it. And man, we played it, and it was, again, it just struck me out of the blue, like, wow, this is an amazing game.
Well, tell me more. From
Fantasy Flight, it was New Angeles, the Netrunner. I guess it's a competitive co-op, is what you would call it. And
so it's like doing a podcast. It's a competitive co-op.
Right.
Gotcha.
Right.
I'll put a pin in that.
But no, I just, it's cool. The Netrunner universe, if you're into the Netrunner universe, it's really, it's tight in that, you can really get in there and play around. Like, I thought it was just like a game in the Netrunner universe. And when it came out, like the little promo articles looked pretty cool, but I didn't really hear anything about it at all. It kind of was a flash in the pan, like, hey, this is for sale, and a couple people said, hey, this is pretty cool, and then I never heard about it again. Well, I finally got to play it, and mostly just because I'm super into Netrunner anyway. I kind of hung on to, I want to play this when I get a chance to, and we got to play it, and man, it was amazing, because I think a lot of the stuff, if I would have been sold on what was in it, I would have been super into getting a hold of it. I don't know why it's not being advertised as such, or why no one's talking, but it is essentially Battlestar Galactica 2nd Edition.
Now with less IP.
Well, yeah, it's kind of less IP, which is just because Netrunner is a smaller IP, I think.
Well, it's their IP.
Yeah, but I think there's definitely that effect that, like, I probably like it a little bit more because it's Netrunner than I would, because I know Netrunner, than I would if I didn't know Netrunner.
Mm-hmm.
But holy cow, it is everything in Battlestar Galactica that's kind of clunky and kind of repetitive. And I say that as someone who really likes Battlestar Galactica. It kind of takes all that stuff and cleans it up. I mean, it really is a 2nd edition of that core engine.
Give me a for instance here.
The basic breakdown of, you flip a card, a bad thing happens unless everyone cooperates to vote it down or vote it up. It's that same mechanic. However, the kind of good and bad things are somewhat more player controlled, so it's not random.
Do you see the deck as players?
No. Well, no. So the way this works is...
Listen, I'm just going to sit here and why don't you tell me about the game, because I clearly have no clue. Oh.
Hey, it's hard to demonstrate a game via radio, right? But the basic mechanism of Battlestar Galactica is you flip over the bad thing happens card, and it says bad thing's going to happen unless you get 10 points worth of cards, and green and red count, and the other ones don't, or they're negative. And then everybody goes around the table and just plays a 4 or a 3 or a 5 or whatever, right?
Or shrugs and pretends they can't put a card in.
Yeah, and that works, and it is super cool just for what it is. But by the time you play Battlestar Galactica 30 times, that phase is a little bit repetitive. It's kind of unexciting. You're just counting colors and numbers. The way New Angeles shakes that up is, instead of the deck kind of feeding out random calamities, there are 5 calamities that are kind of always on the board, and you're just trying to maintain order at the table. So there, instead of a random blah shooting out, it is, if these gang members get to this sector of the city, they cause problems and things happen that make us lose. Or if this disease spreads throughout the city too far, we lose. Or if, like the trash builds up too high or something, the city riots and we lose. But those negative conditions are always in play and always on the board where everyone can see them. And then the voting phase, instead of just throwing cards down to match the numbers, what the voting phase is doing is you're actually playing a card that is a contract. And these contracts are things that clean up the board. So you can put down a contract for the police faction to go round up some gang members. Or you can put down a contract for the science player to go clean up diseases. In that way, instead of voting to prevent the bad thing, you're voting to choose which problem you're going to solve this turn. And where that becomes super interesting is that every time a problem is solved, that player makes a bunch of money from it. And it gets a bunch of, or essentially influence, or I guess it's cash. So, in essence, you are at the same time simultaneously voting which problem on the board is more important to take care of, but you're also voting who at the table is going to get paid. Right? And the victory condition is simply having more money than your opponent. Every time you are offering a contract, you're essentially giving money away to other players when money is the victory condition. So your traitor aspect of this, instead of sabotaging things, it's you holding cards that say, I could clean up the medical emergency that everybody sees. Or if you're the traitor, you can just pretend that you don't have any cards that will help fix the medicine. And it creates the same dynamic as Battlestar Galactica, but it's so much more satisfying than just throwing cards and colors, because you're identifying a problem on the board that needs fixed, but you're also deciding if you really want to give the player across from you a big ton of money to do it.
Well, but hang on. So I'm confused, because if there's all these little tug of wars, and if something goes over the edge, everyone loses.
Exactly.
It's the co-op part of it.
Right.
But yet every single person gets money from their own individualized fix-it solution. How does everyone not just end up with the same amount of money?
Right. So this is the part that I hadn't gotten to yet. And it's fine. Pro tip, start with the win condition and then explain the game, which I didn't do because we weren't actually teaching, but I should have probably.
That's okay.
But no, the real genius of it, and the part that makes this all go, is that there is not a bash the leader incentive in the game. Because, and here's the twist of the game, like most of these co-ops, there may or may not be a traitor. You don't actually know. There's a strong possibility there's one, but it can happen that there's not. But the win condition of the game is like a game like Cosmic Encounter or something. It is possible for all but one player to win. Because the win condition that makes this all work is you are dealt a foe as part instead of a roll, you're dealt a foe.
And so as long as you have the leg up on your specific opponent,
yep, as long as you finish the game with more money than your opponent and the game successfully concludes, meaning that the saboteur doesn't crash the game, and I think it's 6 rounds. So again, the other kind of nice improvement over BSG is the time scale. Even though it's a long game because there's so much more negotiating than there is BSG, it does have a finite end that you can see and predict. And the that win condition, when I learned about it, I was like, that's neat, but it didn't strike me as to how unique it was and how much it was going to affect negotiations, in this particular game.
Yeah.
But because you only have one opponent and not 5 opponents, it really does make you cooperate. However, it also really makes you look like a traitor because, if you're neck and neck with your opponent, you don't want to give them so much as $1, right? And if the player you're negotiating with across the table is not your foe, you have no reason not to just approve everything they put forward, and it creates this really weird dynamic where the entire table is having to negotiate, which contract is going to be. And the way it's done is you play, like, I'm going to play a cure medicine contract for Ninteki to go clean up the mess. And then you propose that as this is on my turn. I'm going to give them a contract to go fix it. And then all the other players at the table, it goes around and they have the opportunity to go, no, I think waste management is more important this turn. And they play their card to let, the trash company go pick up all the trash. And the vote then is the other players at the table deciding which contract to allow to be fulfilled. At the same time, both voting on which problem they're voting on which problem to fix, but they are also voting on who's going to collect money this turn. And it just, I don't even know if that sounds interesting as I'm describing it, but the negotiation phase, that one game of New Angeles, there was more really intense, satisfying negotiations than I think I've had in 5 games of Battlestar Galactica.
Really?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Like, I feel like Battlestar Galactica has these 1 or 2 moments in a game that might really, really get intense.
It seemed like the whole game hinged on the reveal.
Right. And this...
Or did you have to flip the page on your script? What was that?
No, the cat... But I digress.
Back on topic.
Kitten problems. So anyway, the negotiations, instead of that one, all building up to one intense negotiation, we had these super intense negotiations popping up all over the place. And the part that made it really great to me was that there was no kind of signal when that was about to happen, right? Because it was all hinged upon the fact that somebody was going to look up and just be a stick in the mud because they were 2 points behind their opponent or their foe.
Yeah.
And then suddenly they have every excuse in the book not to cooperate.
Yeah.
And as that builds up from turn to turn, it goes from, this is just a little kind of 2 alpha gamers butting heads about the proper move, to why is he so against this? That's got to be a traitor. But then you have that happening 4 or 5 times to where you get to the end, and I've only played this once, so I don't know how often it gets down to the whether or not the traitor is going to win. But in our game, the traitor was like $1 more of profit away from being able to sabotage the game, because that's all that has to happen is it's not even $1, excuse me, it's some kind of corruption track. But they were essentially, 1 step from the game winning and us all losing. And that final round of contracts on the final turn, the whole table was just rampant paranoia about who was the traitor, And it was just, it made such a neat cycle of cooperation and then impasse.
It's like life.
Yeah, and all of it was because of that, having exactly one opponent at the table of 5 people playing this game. One of the players we had was losing his mind because he had actually forgotten, just because the game was intense, he had sort of forgotten the win condition. Like he knew his, and he didn't lose track of that. But somehow within the negotiation, he lost track that we were all operating under the same conditions. And he had this mathematically figured out to the dollar, why we had to do these 3 contracts in this exact order to prevent something bad from happening on the board. All of us were just not interested in hearing it, and it just lined up on the same turn because all of us were like $1 behind our own opponent. Yeah. And so none of us wanted to cooperate. Like, we wanted to do everything he wanted to do, but in the opposite order. That way, if these contracts came out in a different order, then we would jump ahead of our opponent before our opponent jumped ahead of us. And, it just makes such a dynamic negotiation environment that I was just sitting there going, I don't know if I'll ever play Battlestar Galactica again. Because which really
I think
was.
Makes you the Cylon.
Yeah, maybe. I wouldn't actually declare that on any kind of public place like a podcast, but
well, thank goodness someone listens
because
to this
I need to play it 20 more times before I declare something like that, right? Like we have Battlestar Galactica, but first impressions though was I was just over the moon about how great it was. It was outstanding.
If I can go ahead and get us off track already, the thing that I like about a negotiation game where you're negotiating with everyone, however, it's to a specific goal that is openly stated to not be adversarial except to one person.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that's really cool about that, let's back up. I love negotiation games, but I love that feeling of looking at someone and saying, I'm going to offer you something that you're not going to understand. Beyond that, you not understanding it means that it's benefiting me. And for that matter, even if you did understand it, it's still benefiting me because I wouldn't offer anything that didn't, right? Because it's a negotiation game.
Yeah.
I enjoy that. And I think it's fun. And I think that seeing how, honestly, it's not even playing the game and trying to weave a path through all of that to win. Like, all of that aside, just watching people play negotiation games is incredibly fun. However, it's so common in negotiation games to have that person who can't really handle the simple fact that everything that's being handed to them is not in any way, shape, or form beneficial to them.
Right. Poison pill.
Exactly. And for them to come out and make an offer would be them stating what they want open. And you see it all the time. I mean, I've even done it too, where you just sort of freeze and you just go, well, fine, I'm not going to negotiate with anyone, which means you lose. But the idea of saying we're all going to negotiate, however, one of you at this table is my mortal enemy, and all the rest of you can come along for the ride and jump on my coattails. It actually sows even more distrust into the negotiation, but it in a weird way, it's positive. It's beneficial distrust, right? Because now, instead of knowing that everyone is your enemy and therefore distrusting every single thing that they say outright, you now are distrusting them with an air of possibility, right? Instead of perfect knowledge.
Right.
And that's actually pretty clever. I like that.
Yeah, it even happened in this New Angeles game. One of the things I didn't mention that actually happened to me in it was that if you draw your, like, the foe that you're assigned is just, you take one card for every player in the game and the traitor card, and then you shuffle it up and you deal one to everybody. If you get your own, which is what happened to me, I got myself, your victory condition becomes you have to be ahead of two players, and any two players, but you have to be ahead of them.
Huh.
So the game, the money comes kind of in big chunks, right? You're kind of leapfrogging $4, $5, $6 at a time. There was no point at which I would feel comfortable letting anyone be ahead of me, right? Because I had to essentially beat two players. But not only did I have to beat two players, that target changed with every single person that moved up the ladder. So I would be super antagonistic to player A, and then 2 turns later, I'm giving A everything they asked for, and I'm super antagonistic to C, which through table politics, I mean, it just threw it into chaos, right? Because I was behaving to the table super erratically. But even though I was being erratic, I was not doing anything to hurt the game, right? And maybe if we had played this, if it wasn't our first game, that would have been a line of deduction people could have gone down, But just, again, in that initial playthrough, the traitor was being justifiably thrown at every single person at the table, which felt ironically super satisfying compared to something like the Resistance, where you're declaring traitors just kind of because there's nothing else to do but declare someone a traitor. There's nothing else constructive to do but make your own fun by calling everyone names. Like this, we had a couple times where the game just stopped and somebody was like, got on their kind of put on their little judge hat and was be like, let me present to you the evidence. I guess I'd be a lawyer, not a judge, but present the evidence of why player X was responsible for this calamity we were under. And then some other player would be like, I disagree entirely. Here's the reason. Player Y is actually responsible. Oh, it was super great. But to get back to what you were saying about the negotiations, the $1 million question in competitive co-ops, because it seems to come up an awful lot. And that is the whole idea of, if I can't win, then nobody wins is the better result. than me getting second place or third place.
Hmm.
I think you probably think about it like I do, just from knowing you. But
you've made that mistake before.
Right. I have made that mistake before, and I would kind of like to know your philosophy on it, because I see the validity. I mean, let me be frank. The player that says the table loses is a better result than I get second place, I do feel that player is the enemy of fun. Like I 100% follow the logic, but I think that there's some kind of weird social contract violation there that's kind of sucks the fun out of the room. With that being said, I do understand logically that process of thought to say, if I can't win, nobody wins. Whereas I personally feel that to be in the spirit of a competitive co-op, the most important thing is for the non-traitorous players to finish the game. Like that is in some essences a minor win. Like I look at it like a war game, right? Where if we make the game end without the traitor winning, that's a minor victory for everyone involved. And then the major victory goes to the player who scored the most points. That's how I view it. First, survive. We win, and then we crown a king. That's how I think. And I really do think that's how those games are designed. I think that is the goal of a designer that makes that sort of game. That's the result they're looking for. And I think when a player is approaching that with a table loss is a better result than a second place finish, because in a table-wide loss, no victory is assigned. Whereas second place is the first loser, right? So, I see the logic, but I don't think the games are designed with that in mind. And I think when players take that angle, they are sort of undermining the story that the game is trying to tell a little bit.
This is a tough one because I've not had that experience. I can't bring to mind an instance in one of these games where the game was constructed in such a way that we didn't either find out at the very end kind of what was going on. And I mean, like, to be specific, like, a game like Archipelago, right, where the actual points don't come out until the very end. So you can think that you're winning, but you don't know. Or something like Battlestar, where after the reveal, there's direct confrontation between two sides, and it's open at that point. I don't know, and I mean, by all means, tell me if I have participated in a game that I'm just forgetting, but I can't think of one that has presented competitive co-op in such a way where a player can know that they're not going to win with enough turns left to just skunk the game. However, initially, I mean, again, just because I haven't experienced it, I would kind of tend to think that perhaps in that case, maybe the reason that everything kind of became open and perfect information toward the end is because something went horribly wrong. And this is why the players can know who's going to win 5 turns out. And in that case, like, it would be super game dependent as to what would be a faux pas in that instance, because what caused the game to go off the rails. And again, I'm making all sorts of assumptions, but like for example, our game of Dead of Winter that was just hilarious, where I warned you before we played that game that I had the worst track record.
Yeah, that was pretty spectacular. That was the most.
And I was batting a perfect 1,000 on turn 3. I killed 3 characters.
Yeah, that was less like The Walking Dead and more like Game of Thrones kind of level of just character eradication. But
yeah, and I mean that clearly came off the rails.
Yeah.
And clearly it was one of those things where I wasn't playing that game with y'all for the rest of the game, so we ended up finding a funny, jokey way to let me be adversarial.
Yeah, and I think, Dead of Winter is a good one to pull out there, because that is actually one that signals you pretty early that you're not the traitor. Well,
I wouldn't know. I've not lived past the first turn.
But it signals out pretty quickly that you are not going to be able to complete your objective. right? You know, it can be very obvious on turn 3 that you aren't going to have time to do what you need to do. I think if players are playing that way, that there's almost no chance of Dead of Winter ending without the colony collapsing. If a player decides I can't win, so I'm tanking the colony. Because it's just so easy to do. In a lot of ways, I mean, Archipelago is that way too. I know that we've come back to that a couple times, and I actually like to talk about Archipelago a lot because I think it is probably the best game in the genre. And just as a play experience, it does so much interesting things that other games don't do. However, it is incredibly fragile. I mean, quite frankly, it's as easy as sabotaging a real Imperial colony would be, right? Like, you just leave the gates open one night and everybody dies. I mean, it's that easy, and it's that easy in the game. Like, you can create colony collapse at the drop of a hat in Archipelago, and I think it one of the best games of its genre out there when it's working. But if your play group has people in it that will tank a game that they're not going to win, the game, it functionally falls apart, which is a shame because it is so easy to tank. And the key then becomes, you know, I don't know if you're supposed to give a personality test to the people you play with. But no, I mean, it has, I mean, in the past, it's a game that I always feel like I want to sing the praises of it, but I feel like I have to, you know, go through this whole rigmarole of conditional recommendation because it has that kind of structural requirement that, I mean, essentially it's that everybody role plays, right? Because the game is, and again, what makes it so interesting, so unique, and so good is that it is a game of passing the buck, you know, and it's a game of super tight margins. And the whole key is that, you know, we're all gonna, you know, we need to stay alive. We need to work together to keep the colony alive. But the winner is determined by who can kind of glean the most off the top, you know, when no one's looking, you know, and if you can pass the bill for, you know, whatever project needs done, you know, if you can make, you know, the guy across the table pay his resources instead of you, even if it's something profitable, but it puts the person to your right kind of off their game, or stops them from building the thing they wanted to build this turn because they had to pay an extra wood to build a fence to keep the natives out or something. Being able to just kind of leverage responsibility onto other players so that you can just scrape a couple nickels off the top. To me, it's so, you know, as we always talk about, like, we love the games that are making kind of cultural, social statements, you know, and I think that's kind of exploring a whole part of people that you don't see in games a whole lot, you know, and that is squirreling away nickels and making your opponent build the wall, right? and I think that's super fascinating, but for it to work, again, the entire table has to almost be role playing, right? There has to be real consequences to not building the wall you said you were going to build, or not digging the well you said you were going to dig, you know? And if the players are just treating it like a board game, all of that leverage collapses, like it's gone, you know? And
I can't wait to hear your suggestion about how to impose real world consequences.
I don't think you can. I think you just kind of have to have a social agreement that that's how you're gonna play this particular game, as if, you know, the next boat from the old country isn't coming till after the period this game is set at. You know, the next delivery is not coming, so we have to self-sufficient and we have to survive, and we have to fear colony collapse as if it were real, because again, the game functionally collapses if you can't leverage people. The whole mechanic that the game is pushing doesn't operate if there's no consequences, because that's what leverage is, right? Leverage is,
but what about
essentially coercion with consequences, and if there's no consequences, it doesn't work.
But if I just want to sandbag, and by sandbagging I'm forcing you to do the work,
right? But if I decide this is just a board game, and I don't care because I'm losing. Right? You lose the ability. You lose the ability to sandbag, and I guess what
I don't know. I mean, to me, that is sandbagging. You're just taking a different role. Like instead of saying that I am a colonial traitor and I have to do these things. However, I'm a little bit more worried about pineapples than I am meat. You're just making it a little bit more meta by saying, "Well, I'm playing for second place."
Yeah, but if that leads to the
to a certain degree, I'm playing devil's advocate, right? Because we had a recent conversation where we kind of were on opposing sides, of this conversation. But
it's also kind of the same conversation a little bit. I mean, it actually is the same. We talked about play for chaos guy because, and this is essentially the same thing. You're not playing for chaos. You're just stopping playing, right? But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing. I mean, you may be right though. I mean, maybe that's not flawed. Maybe that's just another environment to play around.
Where I'm specifically sort of sticking my, I don't know what I was going to stick. The reason that I'm taking this particular stance isn't to sort of bring up that old conversation and just say that, well, okay, let's back off play for chaos guy. I think that in competitive co-op specifically, I do think there is a certain amount of leeway you have to give other players because you have to remember that they're not playing the same game you are.
Right.
And it's something I have to remind myself all the time when I look across the table and I see someone doing something that I don't get, and my knee-jerk response is to not assume that they're doing something really intelligent that's going to make them win. Sometimes I just go, I don't understand it, therefore I'm going to push my advantage. And that's exactly how you lose a negotiation game of any capacity. Is it when you don't understand something, you go, aha, I have you, because you don't, that literally is hook, line, and sinker. And so I think that in a game where, and again, I'm assuming that the game has hidden conditions because we are talking about Archipelago, but especially in those games, I do think there's a certain amount of leeway that has to be given to players for them to be playing the game that they are playing. Now, again, I understand that there are people who can openly and honestly and aggressively say, I'm tanking this game, we're done here. But that's an easy problem to solve, right? That person doesn't come back to game night. I have no problem with group curation because I don't want to play with jerks. I mean, it takes time, and you can have a polite conversation with them and just say, hey, that wasn't cool or whatever. I mean, again, I'm not here to be a therapist. However, I think that one of the big problems that I see, it's not so much the attitude of saying this is a game and we don't buy into this fiction of running a colony, like in the case of Archipelago. I agree with you that does solve the problem to a certain extent. However, I see the real root of the issue being certainty or presumed certainty, where a player at some point looks around and based on the read that they are getting, they know beyond a shadow of a doubt all the things they don't know. And the game is over 5 turns before it's over. And
yeah.
I, for one, always tell people in games that have hidden win conditions or hidden victory points at the end, I constantly remind people, play it to the end. Play it to the end. Because you never know. We've had games, I mean, for crying out loud, we had a game not too terribly long ago where we were pushing toward the end. Everyone was kind of doing that open discussion about who's about to win the game, and everyone flagged me to be the winner. And I just went, yup, knowing full well that I had nothing that was going to let me win. And so I let the one player I was in competition with assume that they were playing for second place instead of first place, which let me win first place.
Right. And
it actually came to me on the final turn. I was bluffing all the way to the end. That just goes to show you play it all the way to the end. Especially, I mean, that game didn't even have hidden win conditions. Like, that actually was a fairly perfect information game that everyone just sort of had a blind spot on because, we hadn't played the game a lot. But, when there is hidden information, I think that certainty sometimes gets in the way. And then when someone wants to dictate the remainder of the game based on their temporary assessment of details that they don't know, that just seems a little off to me. And so even without saying, all right, for the good of the colony, where are the pineapples? Like, beyond kind of encouraging everyone to buy into this fiction that again, like, no one really cares because we're not selling pineapples. We're moving pieces to get points to do things, right?
Right.
But I do think that it is direct input-output when trying to play a game and win, to not take for granted the stuff you don't know. I say that to me more than I'm saying to anyone else, because there are so many times that I, on turn 2, think that I'm out of a game. And sometimes I'm like, all right, I'm just filling a seat for the next 2 hours. And then lo and behold, at the end I win because I had a giant blind spot. And I've been handed the shut up juice so many times where I make big declarations about, all right, there's the winner, and I'm dead wrong, that I naturally want to encourage others to do the same, especially in a game that is notionally co-op, where it's in all of our interest for no one to make that assumption and to keep on playing. But I don't know. I think that's a little bit more directly to what I would perceive the issue to be, assuming I had actually encountered it, which again I still haven't. But maybe I'm lucky. Maybe I just have good people around me. I don't know.
Yeah, well, obviously you have good people around you.
I was about to say, we all know that's not true. But
I built this game group like Nick Fury, man. But no. Yeah, I guess. I mean, do you think there's some sort of social contract to not do that? Because I know you talk about social contracts all the time, so I'm curious. Do you think there's an actual responsibility to the player that decides that the table loses because I can't win? Are they actually doing are they violating that social contract? Are they doing something wrong, or are they?
So, to back up a little bit, when anyone interacts with a group, part of interacting with that group in order to get whatever the benefit that interacting with the group will give them, as individuals, we have to sort of modify our behavior, right? To act within the group. It's not that we can't do those things. It's just that sometimes, in order for the group to kind of keep moving forward, or at least sometimes for the group to see us as a member of the group, there's certain things we can't do. And giving up I guess you could call it rights to do those things, even temporarily, in order to interact with the group, that is what a social contract is. It's saying, in order to operate in this group, I'm going to not do these things. And that largely unspoken negotiation is what we're talking about with a social contract. When looking at games, it's very similar to the rule set of a game, where if we're playing a game and the goal is simply to win, and we win by making the most money, the game is there to tell us how we can legally, without cheating, make money. That may not include just taking the money and putting it in our pile. The game's going to tell us in what ways we can actually attain the money. And some games have different rule sets for how we're going to do that than other games. And by selecting the game, we select the rule set, and we all agree on that. Where a social contract kind of comes into this is that we as a group, because we have to play these games in a group, even if we're playing multiplayer solitaire, there's certain things that we have to not do in order for everyone at the table to want to continue to play the game to the end, so that by the rules of the game we can find out who won. And that's that sort of unspoken social contract of what we're going to do. And more often than not, that simply refers to very social aspects of it, like how are we going to behave socially while we do this. But the part of it that very often gets misused or misunderstood, or people don't realize it's part of the social contract, is understanding what it is that we are prioritizing when we play. Because one person may want to prioritize the social aspects and just be goofing around and having a good time, whereas another person may want to prioritize the competitive aspects and be very serious. Finding a way to mitigate the differences in priorities about why we're here having this contest and playing this game and figuring out who wins is part of that social contract, because not all of those things are 100% compatible all the time. And those priorities about why we're playing the game oftentimes dictates the way that we play the game. And someone who is more interested in exploration may play fundamentally differently than someone who's just interested in competition. And someone who wants to play socially may play very differently than someone who is most interested in playing efficiently. It's not to say that one person can't do all of those things. It's just to say that at any given time, we as individuals can only have one priority. because we can only have one priority at any given time, that's where this negotiation kind of has to come in to say, how can we make sure that all of our priorities in this group setting, because the group setting is required, are met to an extent to where we can, as individuals, do what we want to do in a way that doesn't make the group fall apart such that none of us get to do what we want to do. But because of that, like when talking about your exact question, I mean, it depends on the group. I don't know. It largely depends on the group and what the motive of the play is of the group.
And just if everybody gets mad,
and those types
like
of things.
If it makes the other 4 people really mad every time you do it, then the social contract is don't do that because you're ruining 4 people's nights. Is that kind of your hot take?
More or less. It's I don't know. It's so circumstantial, and it again. I mean, like even talking about it as a social contract. I mean, that's the thing is that the contracts change table to table, game to game, moment to moment. Again, I'm not talking about universal rules. It's more just sort of understand who you're with and what makes them tick, and more importantly, what is going to change things from being kind of funny on, like not even funny on the edge, right? Because that sounds so dismissive of a lot of what goes on, right? Mm-hmm. But it's more understanding the fine line in between. We're here to do this semi-contentious thing, because again, board games wouldn't have rules if they weren't contentious,
right? That is often lost on people, I think.
Yeah, and where's the fine line between us doing this thing that has to be governed, has to be arbitrated, right, and refereed by this document, and that being a beneficial sort of eustress experience versus a distressful experience that isn't fun. Like what where's that line between sucking the fun out of the room versus going for the big win, right? Or sucking the fun out of the room versus the timely reveal that you're a Cylon, or whatever it is. And it's so circumstantial. And especially with the competitive co-ops, I think it's even more circumstantial just because there are, the arc of the game could present the sort of collective understanding at the table that this one character is the traitor when that character isn't the traitor. Sometimes that stuff becomes so funny that you ride it all the way to the end. I'm not saying take a game for the hilarity of it, because I even that, like, I don't want to say that because it's so marginal.
Yeah.
But there are absolutely instances where maybe the game sort of shook out in such a way that if the particular table is enjoying that experience, roll with it and go with it. However, if the table isn't enjoying it, okay, pull back and let's play to the game to the end, because again, there's a good chance that the winners and losers shake out differently than they're expected. So it's so tough to say. I can only speak for myself, but I would hesitate just because it's not in my nature to sort of throw people under the bus, especially if I'm throwing an entire group under the bus for me to somehow come out as the winner when I'm also defining what winning means. That's the part that kind of is weird to me. Like, if a traitor mechanic is handed to me where I can win by doing the thing the game tells me to do, fine. Like, I will be the best traitor that I can be. Uh-huh. However, if I'm defining what the win condition is kind of on my own to myself without anyone knowing it, and then at the end I go, haha, I won, and you guys didn't even know we were playing this game, that's over the line.
Yeah, that seems pretty... I think I would plant the social contract violation in there. Like, I just wanted to see what would happen if I did this aberrant behavior X for an entire game. Yeah, that's frustrating.
And you should all pat me on the back because I used you as an experiment in a could I pull this thing off game, and not as willing subjects like. But again, I cannot imagine that happening at a table. And if it did, that might be the last time I'd be at that table. So like I said, it's not something I worry about because that's an easy problem to fix. Yeah, at least for me.
I mean, talking through with you right now, I almost wonder if Archipelago isn't as fragile as I think it is. I don't know. I don't
think it is if you play it all the way to the end.
Yeah, maybe not. Maybe it's something I feared more than is actually there. When the game was fresh and new, it was a pretty hotly debated topic, and I could see it, and we played it enough that I didn't have that particular problem at my table, but I could clearly see how it would happen. But I kind of, man, that makes me think a little bit too. I mean, as far as the meta thing goes, we mentioned play for chaos player. we've talked about this before off air, and and I think I kind of want to hear you revisit this because it's the same. No, yeah. Well, what? I'm really curious because I have two minds on this, and it does apply to Archipelago. It applies to the Archipelago person who will not be leveraged because this is just a board game. But it's the same thing in Play for Chaos guy in Axis and Allies or something. It's one of these big negotiation / war game kind of territory control thing where, one player is not behaving predictably. My instinct is to approach that as a game kind of ruiner, right? That is someone who is not, and this fits right into what you were saying. I mean, to me, that strikes me as someone who is not engaging the game as the designer intended, right? That is not creating an environment in which the players can flourish. And part of me, though, also thinks that, if we're kind of simulating global politics, having a player be North Korea, it may not change the game in a way that I want it to be changed, but it's not necessarily an unrealistic game now, or it's not necessarily ruining the simulation for me, or I shouldn't allow it to ruin the simulation for me because people don't behave predictably, or consistently. So if I'm going to have this fantasy where, I'm going to be one of the major global powers and I'm going to do this thing, if I have to deal with a country being belligerent for no reason or going against what is clearly the best option for, 3 players and having the one person not kind of cooperate, I kind of feel like that, again, my gut reaction is to be frustrated that we can't do what we're supposed to be doing, but my kind of meta look at it is, well, this particular sandbox, that's just a new problem that we have to solve while we're playing through this. and it comes up in Archipelago for the same reason, because again, I have another, and this is, the reason I'm asking about this, John, is I feel like I have a blind spot a little bit here.
Well,
and
you're asking for sight beyond sight.
I have this theory that is kind of cemented in my mind that Archipelago only works if everybody pretends it's real, because leverage doesn't work unless there's consequences, as I said. But on the meta discussion of what you were just talking about, does that actually apply to that as well, to where if someone says, I won't be leveraged, are they legitimately just calling the bluff? And even if the game, like the colony, collapses because they said, I refuse to be leveraged, are they actually working against the game, or is that a element of negotiation that I was overconfident in, and I'm reaping my reward for trying to leverage someone, right? I can kind of justify it as being, well, this is a high stakes negotiation and I failed. And do I walk away from it with that and it's just a it's not the player that refused to be leveraged that is at fault. It's me for pushing it too far. Like it's a game of mutually assured destruction, and I went too far, right?
Well, okay, so
if you can unpack that.
Yeah, I was about to say, here comes a salvo of a multi-pronged answer. So get ready for this one. You might want to go make.
Yeah, that's what I was planning. I was actually getting the munchies.
You're gonna go leave.
We're a little on the long side, although this is. I feel like this is good combo, so I'm cool with it. But I need supplies.
You need sundries for.
So
for
I had to tee up 6 monologues. I'm gonna go watch Game of Thrones. Let me know when you're done.
Yeah. Okay. I'll shoot you a text when I have to breathe. No,
Well, first off, do you remember what I said at this point?
I have no clue what your question was, but I'm going to answer it anyway, because that's the best way to do this. Limber up. So, I think that, honestly, this is actually a really easy thing to solve if you chase it a bit to its logical end, where let's assume that you were the smartest person at the table, and let's assume that everyone knew it, and they did it your way. Well, that would result in you winning. So if they're going to try to play to win, then they should do something different. And so to assume that someone would do something for themselves that would result in you winning, it's not even a blind spot, man. It's just it's outright ignorant to think that someone is going to not do something that's in their best interest. And if the logic that we're chasing is that you're the most talented player, well, then you're the last person anyone's going to listen to. And they're going to actively do things to defy you not even defy, just confuse you every step of the way. In that case, again, assuming you're the smartest player there, give them the space to do it, because that's their way of winning. And if everyone's there to win the game, I mean, assuming everyone's not there just to, help you win the game, then yeah, I mean, that's the thing to do. But moreover, even if you're not the smartest player at the table, and I think it's always a beneficial thing to do to assume that I'm not the smartest person at the table, then if I'm not the smartest person at the table and someone is doing something that I don't understand, well, it also benefits in letting them do it. So I say give them the space to do it because, one, they could surprise you. And I mean, I've learned so many times by looking at someone going, I have no clue what they're doing. And then when I find out, one of two things happens, right? Either I go, oh my gosh, they really didn't know what they were doing. Or I realize that there's a whole world of possibility that I didn't see and that my view is now opened if I was willing to assume that they did it intentionally, right? Which I think is a courtesy to extend to someone who gets one over on me like that. So I think that kind of step one is you go along for the ride, assuming, like I said, it's not sucking the fun out of the table because you could get somewhere kind of cool. But two, I do think that in a game that has any sort of diplomacy, and by that I mean negotiation for sort of favor or actions or dispensations in terms of like, okay, don't attack me for a turn, please, or whatever it is. You said something brilliant that I think applies here, but in a totally different way. And that was that auctions are one of the great ways to balance economics in a game. Don't even worry about trying to balance the cost of this thing versus that thing. Let the players determine it in real time based on what's going on in the game, but also just on their perceived value. And if you do that, the game will be balanced. Yep. And I think that's brilliant. And I happen to think that diplomacy and negotiations, in a weird way, does that as well, but in terms of player interaction. And sometimes to its detriment, assuming that players can't realize that what's happening is diplomacy and negotiation, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's much the same way that auctions fall apart when players don't understand that the money still has value even though they're giving it the value.
Right.
And I think that negotiations can fall apart much the same way, hence the player that just says, I refuse to work with anyone. However, there absolutely is room in a negotiation to say, I'm not going to work with anyone because you're holding all the cards. Or, contrary to that, you could say, I'm not going to work with anyone because you want everyone to think you're holding all the cards. Or there's even the opportunity to say, I'm not going to work with anyone because there's this one specific turn that you have no clue what to do, and you need to punt for a little while and let some chaos go on the board so you then can find an opportunity to exploit. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the other thing to realize in those games is that sometimes those decisions are moment to moment. And much how in an auction, the auction itself is a big enough thing to let a turn go completely off the rails, but then the following turns can be back dead center because of the way it all self-balances. I think that diplomacy can do much the same thing, where you can have a turn where, things sometimes can get just incredibly hostile, but if the diplomacy is working correctly and being used as a mechanic, the next turn, maybe the adversaries are now allies, or maybe it's all just water under the bridge, and we're back to dealing with pineapples, or whatever it is.
Oh, wow.
But really, I mean, trying to pigeonhole someone into certain negotiation tactics, or even trying to limit what they choose to value in the negotiation, it very much defies the self-balancing aspect of diplomacy and negotiation as game mechanics if one player, or even for that matter, if there's sort of an unspoken emphasis for all players on valuing one thing or one mode of, or even one approach to the negotiation. So I absolutely think that similarly to how, realizing that playing the game to the end is a beneficial thing to do, to actually see how the game works out. And to remember that there are hidden things and that sometimes the information isn't known. Like those are useful things to do as players of games that have that built into it. And frankly, it's doing a bit of a disservice to the design of the game to assume that the hidden win conditions aren't hidden, right?
Yeah.
I think it's similar in a game that allows for diplomacy to do the diplomacy the disservice of assuming that it's absolute, every single turn. And that makes the game so small. And the reason to put that stuff in the game from a design standpoint is to open the game up, is to make it bigger, is to allow for bizarre things that wouldn't have happened if there was just a list of actions that a player could do. And not even the interest of being open-minded, but I think in the interest of playing a game for all that it's worth, sometimes it's useful just to kind of back off and see how a turn shakes out, or see if a strategy comes to pass, before determining if what you're seeing is tactical or emotional belligerence.
Yeah. And when I said belligerent, I wasn't necessarily talking about overtly obnoxious belligerency.
Yeah.
I was kind of using the global politics version of belligerent, just meaning they're not cooperative, they're antagonizing their neighbors, and in game, not necessarily as a bully personality.
Yeah.
But
the original assertion was that a player behaving like that shuts down the game, and that when the game ceases to function, it is the fault of that player, period, full stop. And that is the thing that I disagree with outright, because feeling that a player doing something odd or off is perfectly natural. It's an observation. However, I don't think that persisting in the thought that they're doing that because they are being emotionally belligerent, or because they just aren't tactically as adept as the other players, like, that's just not a useful thing to assume. I mean, like, assuming a negative motive to someone's behavior when it's not the case is really just a potentially damaging thing to do. You being emotionally belligerent is saying that they need to change. And so that's not really a useful thing just to do outright, without wanting to engage it in some regard. But two, in a game, tactically, it's a bad idea to make an assumption that they're doing it because they're not good at the game, because then that opens up an opportunity for you to be beat because you had a blind spot, like, kind of like you said. However, the bigger thing, and where I really kind of get, where my irritation level with this sort of increases, is when a player starts to vocalize and assert, and they're misattributing the reasons why. And in doing so, though, they're trying to dictate a certain methodology or mode of play or something like that the table may not have actually agreed on. And that right there, going back to the whole social contract thing, is a violation of letting everyone be somewhat independent and let them pick in what way they want to interact with the game. Or even if not interacting with the game, letting them pick what the thing is that they're going to give up in order to then interact with a group. That's a really dangerous thing to do, which is why I kind of think that giving people space is sometimes the better option, and wait until the end of the game to solve the situation, if there's even a situation at all to be solved. But it's a fine line, right? I mean, because it can start out with someone pursuing a strategy where they say, nope, I'm not working with anyone. And next thing you know, they've isolated themselves, and now they really aren't working with anyone, and now it's personal.
Yeah.
And that's where sort of keeping a pulse on actually what's going on and where the line is incredibly important. But part of that, and this is what it all comes down to, irrespective of whether you're dealing with an unknown strategy or just simply a behavior that seems off or odd, or in some cases alarming, I start with not assuming much.
Right.
And that's when I kind of go into what's going on here mode. Just asking the question instead of assuming a stance and then presupposing a solution to a problem I don't know. Because let's really be honest, like, when an assumption is made about what the problem is and then the problem is attempted to be solved via that solution, like, that's a recipe for a disaster at a game table.
Yeah.
And so I think that's where it's useful to just kind of back up and just say, what's going on here? Because there are a million reasons, especially I've seen some wonky stuff in diplomacy games that, had I not been willing to it wasn't even in some cases willingness. Sometimes it simply was just the structure of the game forced me to step back and have to bide my time for a couple turns to regroup or whatever. I could have pushed things in an odd direction, or I could have missed something, or I could have missed out on a strategy that I then use later. So I think it's useful to back up and see what's going on. But also, I mean, like, we all, at least, in our little group, we definitely talk about game theory somewhat, and we all know that the player that refuses to work with anyone is the player that loses.
Right.
And again, it's part of the observation to wait for the turn, right? And if a player's using that as a strategy to win, at some point there's going to be a turn. And if there's not a turn, that's when you can kind of go, okay, maybe this is something else. But I don't know. I think not making assumptions is step one. Step two is asking the question. Whatever. I'm not even going to get into steps because it's so pointless. But
I want a 6-step program, John.
I'm not going to do that. But I absolutely see. I mean, again, like to completely just talk around in circles because I'm totally confused and I have legitimately forgot what the question is at this point. I know. Yeah. Like the game I brought up earlier that I bluffed my way to victory. It wasn't even a diplomacy game, and it just it
was divulgare eloquentia.
That's what it was. We all had put it in our heads that in our particular game, whoever actually won the papacy via votes was going to win the game. Mm-hmm. And the votes were hidden. However, everyone sort of had a read on it. And we were all doing that thing of going, well, you just took one of these. Therefore, you think you're in the running. So I can assume that you were, and we started doing that whole, like, assuming what each other had based on what the actions were. I was firmly in the running for a while. And then everything went off the rails because of a couple turns. However, it's like no one noticed it. And everyone just assumed that I was still in the running. And so I let them assume that I was in the running while I tried to figure out what I was doing.
Yeah, you actually, I mean, in that particular game, you did, whether it was intentional or not, you essentially paralyzed two players at the table because we didn't know whether to zig or to zag. Because, one of us was going to beat you and one of us was going to lose to you, depending on which path we took. And neither one of us knew which path to go. Neither one of us knew which thing to concede to you.
Well, and from my standpoint, though, it was hilarious, but also a bit concerning because I didn't do it intentionally. Like I literally was dropping back for a turn to punt to figure out what points were left on the board I could scoop. And
we were all like, he has to have a plan, so there's something we don't know. We better not go in there.
Which was phenomenal. Like I mean, talk about a freebie. Like to someone who's scrambling for a secondary plan, what a freebie to have everyone assume you know what you're doing. And then suddenly everyone left this giant hole and no one was picking up votes anymore because they thought I had it, and the exact number of votes got left on the board and I scooped them on the last turn and won. That was, in a weird way, kind of a bit of a shocking kind of like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that just happened. And we all laughed to no end about it and we're kind of shocked that it worked out that way. But that's just one long example about how, making an assumption about why a player's doing what they're doing, aside from just being kind of a not great thing to do from a social standpoint, it's not even a good thing to do from a gameplay standpoint. I mean, it honestly is bad strategy to feel like at any given time, beyond a shadow of a doubt, what the other player is thinking and what their motivations are.
I've come around. I think I've outgrown you're not playing right, because there was a time when that's how I felt, like legitimately. I still probably revert to that a little bit sometimes, just subconsciously. That, this game isn't working because you're not playing right. And, having these discussions with you and even being on the other side of those discussions where the comments of someone not playing right being directed at me, when I, as you said, I clearly have a plan and a reason. And even if the reason maybe is tactically wrong, I still walked through and did things for a reason. It wasn't random. Having a couple experiences where that was turned on me, that's kind of opened my eyes a little bit to not relying on that kind of crutch of you're not playing right. I think that's a healthy thing to that I will try to keep in mind, because ultimately it's the whole simulation sandbox of putting yourself in the shoes of whatever story the game is telling, putting yourself in the shoes of a character in that story. It's not the failure of my game going off the rails is not Play for Chaos Guy's fault. It's my fault for not negotiating that there's someone at the table playing for chaos.
Yeah.
Instead of shining that out to the table, you guys aren't playing right, and putting it back on yourself of I just performed poorly in this environment. I think that's a much more constructive way to
Well,
to look at
not to make a Chuck Heston reference, but it's a little bit like Omega Man, right? Where it's easy to find oneself in a situation where you're looking out the table going, everyone here isn't playing right. And then you find out you're the monster.
Are we allowed to have two podcasts that end with Chuck Heston references?
Is that the second one? Oh, no.
Yeah, we already did a Planet of the Apes one, right?
I'll keep talking. We'll find a different ending. But
There you go.